My name is Erica Nankinyas, and I'm the Associate Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here. And it's my privilege, and I'm very excited to introduce our moderator for this evening and the program in general here at the Ransom Center. But before we get started, I wanted to extend a very special welcome to our Ransom Center members, Advisory Council members, and our special guests, and of course, everyone who's joining us online. So welcome. I also want to encourage you to pick up a copy of the fall program calendar if you haven't already. And we, of course, look forward to welcoming you back to many more programs at the Ransom Center this fall. After tonight's program, of course, our gallery will remain open, so you can spend more time in the fabulous new exhibition we just opened, Visualizing the Environment, Ansel Adams and His Legacy, curated by Dr. Steve Hoelscher. So it's my pleasure to introduce Steve, who will be in conversation tonight with our special guest, Richard Misrach. In addition to being the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Liberal Arts, Steve serves as our faculty curator for photography here at the Ransom Center. While his research activities and teaching are broad in the field of the history of photography, they're grounded in issues of American race and racism, the construction of a sense of place and space, and of course of cultural memory. He is, of course, very widely published and frequently published. His most recent book project in 2013, Reading Magnum, was recognized as Photo Book of the Year by American Photo Magazine. And it was personally just an honor to collaborate with Steve on this exhibition project, and I know we're all looking forward to tonight's discussion. So please help me in welcoming Steve Hoelscher.
Thank you very much, Erica. It's truly a great pleasure to be here tonight. It's my honor to welcome you here and to tell you a bit about our special guest. One of the most influential photographers working today, Richard Misrach, has produced an impressive body of work that spans 5 decades and consistently garners international critical attention. New York Times critic Taju Cole is merely one of a long line of critics who praises Misrach for, as he put it, quote, his meticulous, large format photographs that are enlivened by surprising details. Cole might have been referring in this case to the 2016 award-winning Border Cantos project, but it could be applied to all of Richard Misrach's oeuvre, which stands out for its ambitious scope and prodigious productivity. To date, he has published more than 20 books and has had one-person exhibitions at the National Gallery of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Centre Pompidou Paris, among many others. His photographs are held in collections in most major institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the National Gallery of Art, the Pompidou Center, the Whitney, the Amon Carter Museum, and more. Much of that work is part of an ongoing project that he calls Desert Cantos, a multi-layered study of the relationship of people and the environment. In addition to its innovative structure, which allows Misrach to divide his epic project into definable, relatable components, the Desert Cantos provided the platform for 2 practices that are widespread today, but groundbreaking in the 70s and 80s, grounds which Misrach himself helped create. The first, the use of color for serious art photography, and second, its large-scale presentation. What Cole doesn't mention, maybe because it's just too obvious, is the high political voltage that runs through much, not all, but much of Misrach's work. Few issues, for instance, in 2016 fueled greater political debate than migration across the US-Mexico border. But he's also grappled with such problems as pollution in Cancer Alley, the Mississippi River's industrial corridor, lingering radioactivity from nuclear testing sites, and human-made natural disasters of flooding communities in California's Salton Sea. In every instance, including those photographs of rotting animal flesh, radioactive sand dunes, and industrial smoke, Misrach's meticulous large format photographs are rendered with a formless impulse and intention to visual beauty that presents an ongoing challenge for many critics. Rebecca Solnit put it this way, quote, "The tremendous traditional beauty of Misrach's photographs and their complex political implications aren't congruous. That is, Misrach upends customary understandings of what traditional landscape photographs are supposed to look like, introducing politics to the scene and moving forward something like history painting, a vehicle for epic, for narrative, for exhortation of morality, and examination of the national consciousness. In this, of course, Richard Misrach is not alone, but his early and ongoing efforts to address issues of social concern through visual beauty invariably expose the wide disparity between form and content in landscape photography. For me, it's a personal pleasure to welcome Richard Misrach to the Harry Ransom Center tonight to discuss these issues and more. Richard and I first met in 2010 when we sat for 2 days in his Emeryville, California studio to discuss his long career. Sponsored by the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, the oral history interview reveals a photographer highly cognizant of both the long history of photography that precedes him and how his work departs from that history. Ansel Adams, with his large format camera and his quest to make beautiful pictures of the environment, emerged during our conversation as one of the key touchstones for the interview. Hearing more about that influence and how Richard's work has gone in many different directions is the theme of our evening tonight. So we'll begin with a presentation that Richard will provide of his long career and the role that Ansel Adams played in it. Then he and I will have a conversation about this important work, and then we'll open up the conversation for you, our audience, to follow up with your own questions. Finally, and to conclude, Richard has kindly agreed to a book signing for those who may have purchased his important recent book on landscape and meaning, which is for sale right outside our doors here. And with that, please join me in welcoming Richard Misrach.
About 3/4 of it. Okay. Hello, everybody. Sorry. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Okay. So we have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to kind of move through quickly just to kind of feed the beast a little bit. And I think the main thing that I want to get across today, I've been a photographer for over a half century. I began in 1970, trying to think, 67. So I'm going to do this because at the very beginning, Ansel Adams had a very big bearing on everything that came after. In 1967, I moved from Los Angeles to go to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, to school in Northern California. And that was the height of the Vietnam protests. It was a really turbulent era. I went to Berkeley as a math major. I didn't do very well in that, so I moved to a psychology major. And, but during that period, I discovered on campus an art studio that was a non-accredited studio. And Roger Minnick was the director at the time. And he has one photograph in the show. And then there was 2 other photographers on the staff. And I went there to actually throw ceramic ashtrays for my parents for Christmas gifts. And on the back wall, there's a small gallery wall. It held about 15 8x10 images, was a show of Roger Minnick's portraits. And I was dumbfounded. I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. I was so profoundly moved. It just transformed my life at that moment. I became interested in photography because of it. I started using the facility at the art studio. They had ceramics, etching, lithography, and a photography lab that was available for students for a minimal cost. And so I started going to the studio. Roger and two other people on the staff would show me how to develop film and to print and how to make a better print, that kind of thing. And that's basically how I learned photography. What was interesting is at that point is I was falling in love with photography and learning about photography. And again, this was at the height of the Vietnam War. But I was also falling in love with landscape photography. In California, there was the F-64 movement. This was a number of photographers, including Edward Weston, it wasn't Minor White, it was Win Bullock and Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham. These were photographers that used large format cameras to photograph the Western landscape. And this was having a big, big impact on me. And again, at this point, I'm like 18, 19 years old. This photograph is from that period. It was a 35 millimeter black and white photograph, Death Valley, clouds at night. And one of the influences at this point was what Ansel Adams called his zone system. And he was known as, and by the way, he was definitely a legendary status back then. As great as all those other photographers, the Westons and Imogen Cunningham and other people, Ansel Adams was the king. It just was that way. He was really revered, and his photographs were kind of the standard. And he also had, kind of fetishistically, this idea of controlling the photographic process in a way that, for example, the zone system would be basically you'd expose the negative in a very certain way with a light meter. And then when you develop the film, you would control how long you develop, which would affect the contrast of the film. That's it in a nutshell. And so I applied that technique to my 35 millimeter technique at the time and was very conscientiously trying to make Ansel Adams-like photographs of the landscape. Let's see, whoops, I went the wrong way. Soon thereafter, though, around 1972, I started to rebel a little bit. I decided I didn't want to do landscapes anymore. I was living in Berkeley, seeing people on the street, and I felt like I wanted to photograph that. But at this point, I adapted Ansel Adams' technique. That was still really important to me, his beautiful silver prints. I wanted to photograph people on the street, but make them beautiful as photographic objects. And so what I did is I switched to a 2¼ camera. I put it on a tripod. I exposed very carefully for the shadows and developed for the highlights, and made these very careful prints. Again, something that I think Ansel would have liked. And so I'm going to show you a few of these. I'm going to kind of go quickly through things. So this was around 1972 to 1974, and I'm like 22 years old. And then something kind of major happened. I started reading Eastern philosophy, Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, and there was this idea that I read, and it said that we go through life and we're not conscious. And basically, we just get into these routines and don't pay attention. And so what you need to do is take one day out of your life and do everything the opposite you normally do it. If you brush your teeth with your right hand, brush it with your left. If you take the trash out in the morning, don't, etc. And if you do one day like that, you become really aware of what you do. And I love that idea, and I said, I want to apply that to photography. So what I did was I went into the darkroom, took all the Ansel Adams techniques that I had learned, and did them all wrong. What I did was, in the old days, again, I'm not sure how many of you are even aware of this, but before digital, you would put a negative in an enlarger, project light through it onto paper, take the paper, put it in a developer, put it in there for 2 minutes and slosh it around, then put it into a stop bath, then into a fix, and so on. And this was quite a process. And you do this in the dark with special lights. Well, what I would do is I'd expose the paper and I'd put it in the developer and I'd turn the room lights on, you know. Or I would expose the paper, take a mark slot right on the paper, and then I put it in the fix first, the wrong chemicals. And I just did a whole series of doing everything intentionally wrong. And eventually, I came up with these experiments where I was exposing things. And I came up, the actual images had this kind of pink cast, so it was beautiful, and there was my writing on it. And it was a series I called the Pink Zen Suite. And I've never really showed this work. I did it for about a year, but it was a way of unlearning Ansel Adams. This is another one. This actually was a tree I did in Yosemite. This is another little tribute to Ansel. I did a tree, but then this is the exposed part of the negative that you're never supposed to print, and I kept that as part of the print and turned it pink. And the prints are actually quite beautiful, and sometimes there's ink on it and all kinds of funny things. But so I was experimenting wildly, kind of unlearning that master technique. Out of that, one of the things I did is did one of the things that said, whatever you do, do not mix selenium toner and sepia bleach. If you do, the thing might go on fire or something. I didn't know. But of course, I had to do it. And I did it, and I did a whole series of tests like that, and I came up with a gorgeous, gorgeous toning scheme, which was, it would take a black and white photograph, and I put this, after I develop it normally, it would take a black and white photograph, and the gray areas, the mid-gray values would be gray, the highlights would be gray, but the shadows would go kind of a rust brown, beautiful. And it was a split tone technique that only because of this series of mistakes I'd made had led to where I could control the mistakes. And at that point, I was also vandalizing my notion of Ansel Adams, along with my technique, where I'd go into the desert and I would work at night and take a handheld strobe and barbecue cactus at 25 feet. Just light them up, light up the desert and record it on film. So I would strobe these things. I left the black edges of the border, which was a no-no at that time. I used my split tone technique, and so I was kind of, it wasn't all consciously rebelling from Ansel, so to speak. And the way I would put it is, Ansel was he was such a powerful figure. He was so important that for anybody to make a new contribution, you had to kind of break away. And this was my method of breaking away. And in a way, one of the things that Ansel used to say later on in life was that if he had been born later, and we had a conversation one time, if he had been born later, he probably would have been making video art and not black and white silver prints. So in other words, he was aware that he was of his historical moment and that each new generation has to come and do something really different. So this opened me up to experimentation and playing and introducing, which was a mind-boggling color. This was no longer a black and white photograph. This was a tritone. It had actually this rust brown. And I started looking at painters like Rothko and Joseph Albers and people that use minimal color in their paintings. And I was going, that's kind of what I'm starting to do. I'm starting to introduce color. And so this series, between 1975 and 77, I photographed at night in the deserts. I stopped working in the daytime. I used a strobe, artificial light. I left these rough edges. Ansel wrote a letter to my gallery saying how much he didn't like that. He was very polite, though, but I just should say he was actually a genuinely sweet human being, and he was just worried about me. He was worried that I was kind of, where was I going with all this? So I did a whole series of these, did a book of these. But what happened was I went, oh my God, this is color. I mean, why aren't photographers, and back then, photographers and Ansel Adams and Edward Weston and minor white and black and white. That was what, color was still considered vulgar and commercial and not a viable medium, and it was still kind of raw. This is a sandstorm that I photographed. I made 6 exposures and my camera broke, but I couldn't resist photographing, and that sand just destroyed it. That's a long exposure of Lake Havasu with a star going through it. And 1976, I went to Stonehenge and photographed stones at night. And I'm sorry, for some reason, we were having trouble tonight with the projections. That the images aren't as sharp as they usually would be, so forgive us for that. But and then Ansel wrote some letters to me, and we had a bit of correspondence. He also invited me to teach at his workshops, the Ansel Adams workshops in Yosemite and in Carmel. And again, this is some reason it's out of focus up there, so I'm going to read it. And it said, this is a letter I wrote to him. Recently, I've been going through my archive, and I've been finding some correspondence from him and some from my retorts back to him. This is back to him. I can't tell you how delighted I was to receive your letter. I know you can't possibly have that kind of time to spare, and your thoughtfulness and sincerity are equally appreciated. Of course, I respect you and your contributions a great deal, so your response to my work is welcomed, and although I wish we had time to sit down and have a thorough and provocative dialogue, there are a few things I'd like to mention here. I don't have my glasses. I didn't know I was going to be reading, so just forgive me. It seems to me that you are in somewhat of a funny position. You have come to symbolize an important period in the history of photography and art. The contribution you made so significant and so great that you posed the challenge not to do equal or better than you, but to do differently, but equally well than you. Photographers now must engage in a number of issues left unresolved by you. In some cases, they must react to you. So we had a little bit of a dialogue, and again, he was kind of criticizing my technique of the other work, and how to improve it. And again, he came from a different tradition, and he was that tradition. This is another letter from my archive. Dear Ansel, thank you for your letter. I also enjoyed visiting with you in San Francisco. I wish there was more time to sit down and discuss some things. I know how busy you must be, but your comments stimulated a few thoughts that I wanted to share with you. It seemed to me a medium in its most alive and vital condition is when in something of heated dialogue as photography is now. Right. What is needed is not the affirmation of the concrete and issues of concepts and issues of photography that you are so keenly articulated, but rather antithetical positions that can push or scratch. You know what? I can't read it. It's all right. Forgive me. Oh, could you read it from down there? Oh my God, thank you. I'm going to go back real quick if you want to just read it. I just can't read it from here. I'm going to move on just for time. This was a letter that he wrote to my gallery about the book that they published with my night desert pictures, and it was actually very nice. And again, and one of the things in my archive, I know they're in there somewhere, I found letters to editors by Ansel about the environment. He was a very early environmentalist with the Sierra Club. They did the Sierra Club books. Those are really important to my development. And they were all gorgeous pictures of perfect landscapes. But in 1978, I rebelled again. I discovered with my night desert work, the split toning, that color was powerful and it was very photographic. And photographers really weren't using it before that. And so I went into Hawaii. I took my strobe. I put color and film in my camera, and I just barbecued vegetation at night in the Hawaiian jungles and just lit it up. And again, this was so different than what Ansel and the F-64 school of photography were doing back then. And suddenly, to me, black and white was no longer realism. Up until then, it was always considered a form of realism. Then it looked completely abstract because it was black and white. To get realism, you kind of had to have the world is in color. So this was my first experiments with shooting 2¼ strobe in the jungles of Hawaii. And Ansel was wonderful and generous, and he invited me to come teach workshops, so I taught workshops with him in Carmel, California. This is a poster for that. I also did it in Yosemite. That's me with teaching my class in Carmel and with the strobe. This was another letter. Ansel was actually very politically active. And again, his photographs are not obvious, they don't reflect that, but he was great that way. He was really, really progressive and thoughtful. And then I go back to being Ansel again. So I moved back from the 2¼ camera, the smaller camera, and I moved back to the large format 8x10 view camera with film, which was Ansel's, he was kind of the key person that used that. Now what I did is I went back into the landscape in color, and I photographed landscapes and strived for the kind of quality that Ansel did, but in color. And my landscapes were not pristine, perfect wildernesses, but endangered, troubled landscapes. I can see I'm running out of time, yes? Okay. All right. So I photographed the Salton Sea, a man-made flood in the Salton Sea. It became a series called the Desert Cantos. There's now 40 cantos. This is the Salton Sea called the Flood. This is from the fires. These are all where the collision between civilization and nature. Again, Ansel did gorgeous pictures. That's the fires. This is the pit, mass graves of dead animal in the Nevada desert. And then I've got to show these. This is Yosemite. I was invited to do a residency, and I decided to photograph Ansel Adams' landscape, but instead of perfect half dome and everything, I photographed smog and fires and human intervention. So this is a burnt forest and half dome. That's a parking lot. Ansel didn't show parking lots, but they're there. Smog in Yosemite. Cars in Yosemite, picnic tables in Yosemite. This was, what Ansel did was, so I was having a dialogue directly with him here. So I got this residency, and I felt like I just wanted to literally respond to Ansel. I'm going to keep going. This is from Petrochemical America. I went to a place called Cancer Alley between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It's where the industrial petrochemical companies are just terribly polluted the communities there. That's actually a Norco cumulus cloud. That's actually, there's a town called Norco there, which is an industrial town. That's a man-made cloud. That's not a real one. This is, dead fish, and this is a Dow chemical site that's overflowing with chemicals. Then a more lyrical thing, again, a little retort to Ansel. He did the Golden Gate before there was a bridge. We bought a house there in the Berkeley Hills in 1998 or 1997, and I looked out the window and went, "Oh my God, I've got this view." So I did a whole, 4 years. I photographed it almost daily. Same exact view over and over again, just different light. Series on the beach, but I'm going to go through quickly because of time. We can talk about that later. But all shot with an 8x10. Then the border, U.S.-Mexico border. I've photographed that, collaborated with a composer, sculptor named Guillermo Galindo. Photographed the whole 2,000 miles from Tijuana to the Gulf of Mexico. This was, I think the first one was around 2004, but the body of work really took off, I think, around 2009. And the show and the book came out in 2015. Yeah, these pictures of human effigies along the border was shot in 2009. I did a thing called The Writing on the Wall with neo-Nazi graffiti. This is fairly recent. I'm sorry, I'm going real quick. I did a book not too long ago called Notations. This was inspired very much by Ansel Adams. Basically, Ansel, there's a quote at the beginning of the book. It says, Ansel Adams, a classical pianist, as well as a renowned photographer, compared the photographic negative to a musical score that can be interpreted in numerous ways. And he always talked about that. Some of his negatives he printed like literally 500 different ways over the years. And so I love that idea of the negative being something. So I did a book of turning my images into negatives, and that's the final image. That's why they're shown in galleries and in books. Recently, I've been doing these, I made a film with my son, and I took transformed those negatives into positives in the film thing, and then I realized that the stills of them at different points, this is my wife Miriam, split frame, half negative, half positive. So again, it's kind of, my experimental nature keeps coming back as opposed to Ansel's very pure, consistent approach. And this last series, this is recently, during COVID, we moved into a condo in San Francisco, and turns out we have an incredible view there. We didn't know it at the time, but I've been photographing the cargo ships on the bay there. And this is a new show and book that's currently happening. And here, probably hard to see, but there's a little figure down there, and it's actually somebody on a board, just to show the detail. That's thanks to Ansel. That attention to detail and quality has always been very important. And that's it. Thank you. You want to be over there? Yeah. Yeah, great.
Thank you very much, Richard. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who could have sat for another couple hours and just looked at your photographs and heard your stories. But one thing that you said about Ansel, it just sort of occurred to me now. I just finished reading a biography of Beethoven. And Beethoven had a really hard time with string quartets because Mozart set the standard. What was he going to do? And it took him a long time to really begin to write string quartets because Mozart was this overwhelmingly large force out there that everybody recognized as God.
Yeah, yeah.
And it strikes me a little bit similar. I guess that makes you Beethoven if Ansel is Mozart.
Okay, okay, that's all right. But I think
Yes.
that's actually true. He was so, again, this is over a half century ago when I was a very young beginning photographer. He stood alone. He really stood out from everybody. And there's a lot of other great, I mean, there's brilliant people out there, but he really, and you know, from Dorothy Lang and Walker Evans and Robert Frank and Edward Weston, but Ansel just was on that other level for you know, the whole culture, the whole photographic culture.
What would you say, I mean, you've talked about him quite a bit tonight, but what would you say was, if you could identify one or two main influences that you've taken with you still to this day that we should remember from Ansel?
Well, the quality thing, I still always try to achieve just this you know, this high quality. I've never really been a 35 millimeter photographer. Now that said, I've used my cell phone recently actually, and he would probably be horrified. But like on the border or places or with the writing on the wall when I'm photographing in these buildings that are scary and violent, I would use a cell phone so I can get in and get out fast. So that is a little different. But otherwise, even with the cargo ships, I try to achieve this kind of this highest quality that photography is capable, and I think that, and I have to say this. So around 1971, I was invited to go to his house with Roger Minnick. Actually, Roger was invited. He took the other staff. At that point, I was on the staff at the studio. We got to go visit Ansel's house, and at his house, he played classical music, and he was really a fine classical musician. And he had just gotten a business agent who showed us a 20 by 24 photograph of moonrise over Hernandez. It was one of his most famous, which at that time was considered a giant photograph. People didn't print large back then, and they wanted $250 for it. And I thought, oh my God, someday that'll probably double. And I called my father because I couldn't afford that kind of money. But I called my father, and he laughed at me. He said, you know, photography is not worth anything. But you know, that photograph today, I wish I had bought it. You know. But the point is that back then, that size, or maybe it was in 16 by 20, I don't know, but that was considered really large. Everybody did the 8 by 10, 11 by 14. Today, with the technology, we're printing 8 by 10 feet. You know, I mean, it's really common to go giant scale and really take on scale. But the quality that he brought to it enables us to kind of go there. Because small negatives, you really can't do that. It just falls apart.
Right. Well, maybe we could talk a bit about scale and also color. You do state in your book that crucial understanding how different elements give meaning to an image, scale and color are as important as the content of the picture. So what you show is, well, it's important, but so are scale and color. Could you talk a bit more about that? I mean, the effect of scale and color on the meaning we take from it.
Yeah, so, and this is something I recommend if there's students here and stuff. At some point I had a group of a salon, like an artist salon, where people brought prints and things like that. And in 1979, I was showing my pictures of Hawaii and printing them Ansel Adams size, is the way I'll put it, like that, 16 by 20. I put it on the wall. And I was talking about these images that I showed tonight of these vegetation, and I was explaining how I was in the jungle and I was overwhelmed by it. I was just blasting it. You know, it was like dark and I couldn't see anything. And one of the members said, she said, you know, well, if that's the way you feel, then when you're standing in front of a small photograph, you overwhelm it. If you want to be overwhelmed, if you want to share that experience, make the print larger. And so at that point I went, oh, that's good. So I went to 30 by 40, you know, something like that. And I was like, that time it was giant. People thought that was really large. But it changed. Suddenly I was overwhelmed by the image. And I just kept growing. So recently, I mean, in the last 10 years, I've printed a number of images 8 by 10 feet. And Like I photographed Hurricane Katrina, and I put that work away for the 20-year anniversary, which is next year. And those pictures are printed at 8 by 10 feet because I want the viewer to experience what happened in Katrina by that giant scale. Again, and I've done small prints too for other purposes, but that's a different experience. So I think color and scale are critical for enabling a certain level of experience beyond just the content.
And it is funny when you mention color, that how revolutionary that was. And you write in your book about how important Sarkowski's William Eggleston's guide was to that, and how for us today it's just kind of weird, really, to think about black and white as like real.
Yeah.
But that was the case, wasn't it? That was what was considered reality through a photograph.
Before 1975, black and white photographs were considered pure realism. There was no qualification to it. There was no, oh, that's in black and white, that's abstracted. Once you introduce color into the thing as part of the new language, that changes. Suddenly black and white feels very dated, feels very much of an era in a kind of like a Nietzsche photograph, or something. The materials really dictate an era.
Your photographs, well, one thing I did want to talk about is how beautiful they are. And we saw that tonight. And one of the things that we've talked about is the importance of beauty to your work. And it seems to me as though that's also something that you get from Ansel Adams, this belief in the power of beauty to convey messages. And maybe you could talk a bit more about that you are, it seems to me, also really trying to make beautiful photographs no matter what the content is.
Yeah. So probably a good example of that is the dead animal pits, because I heard some people kind of gag when they saw those. And they're very difficult. So I photographed these mass graves of dead animals in the Nevada desert. And I made a lot of pictures. And it was really important for me to edit the very best ones, meaning the ones that were composed well, that the lighting was right, that it all came together as a picture. And part of that, and I'm not sure how much that has to do with Ansel, although probably some of that training comes through, or the sense of being able to do it. But I was looking at great paintings like the Raft of the Medusa or Picasso's Guernica. These are paintings of very difficult subjects, but they're awe-inspiring objects to look at because of the way they're painted, because of their scale, right? Their composition, all that, the content. So it transcends content, and I wanted to do that with photography. So for me, news photography, I could photograph the pit, had an article be in the New York Times, and you'd look at the picture, and the next day you throw it away and replace it with the next day's picture. For me, art is something that stays with us, that lives longer. Again, like Medusa's, the Raft of the Medusa, or the Picasso's Guernica. Those great paintings, you go back and look at them, and they are of a historical moment. They transcend the darkness of them and make you meditate on them, I guess. In other words, beauty is a way to engage the viewer to deal with it longer. And I guess that's what I was really trying to do. And again, I think, at least technically, I got a lot of that from Ansel. That technical, the belief in that beauty of the photographic print and the photographic object.
But it has gotten you into a bit of trouble sometimes, hasn't it, with the critics? I mean, we could talk about that a little bit. I mean, I mentioned this in my introduction, and I do want to read a portion from your book. You say that my work over the past 50 years, has been about navigating two extremes, the political and the aesthetic. And I've never been able to reconcile them. But I think it's the tension between the love of the inherent magic of the medium and the power as a tool for change that has kept me personally engaged. And so that was one of the things that really attracted me about your work. It's incredibly beautiful, but it often deals with very difficult topics. And sometimes this is confounded critics, as we've talked about. I mean, what do you do in making beautiful photographs of such difficult topics? So maybe you could talk a bit more about that, this tension between beautiful and ugliness. Ugliness as the social relations behind what made this scene.
Yeah. I guess it's more of what I was saying, but I think that I just want to sustain the viewer's interest, and I think that aesthetics is a tool to do that. And you know, well, you invited me here, so at least with one person,
Yes.
that it has worked.
Oh, yes.
No, but I mean, yeah, but there's been legitimate questions about that. Am I aestheticizing the horror? You know, I forget who wrote it, but somebody wrote that there's no writing poetry after the Holocaust. Adorno, I think, maybe wrote that.
Yeah.
Theodore Adorno. That it's too serious. But my feeling is art is a way to engage us in difficult things. So my photographs of Bravo 20 bombing range, or the nuclear test site. My hope is that people who don't know anything about those places or haven't paid, but look at them and go, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And think about it. What are we doing as a civilization, as human beings? It's not just news. It's not just news. It's using aesthetics, a la Ansel, and Ansel did it, to pay attention to the national parks, to love them, and that works too. But to think about the other issues and how they clash with that beauty is what is important.
And I think, like you said, it helps focus our attention, helps keep our attention. It draws our eyes in, and maybe it doesn't tell you why those animals are there, but it might lead you to ask those questions.
Yeah.
But it does also make me wonder about the power of photography to actually bring about social change. And this is something that in your book you talk about how the wonderful photographs we saw of Berkeley in the early 70s, Telegraph, 3 a.m. I mean, I didn't realize how cool it was to get a call from Cornell Kappa to go out to the newly created International Center for Photography and to show your work there, and what a real honor that was. But you did say that it was sort of a discrepancy when you realized that maybe this work was not having the effect that you wanted it to. So could you talk about that? I mean, how can photography actually bring about change, whether in ourselves or broader change?
Yeah, so this body of work was when I was 22. I photographed the street people on a five-block stretch near the Berkeley campus. And when I was going to work at the studio, at the lab, I would pass them every day, and I felt intimidated. So I had a dream, and that dream said basically you need to photograph them, and it showed me making those images. And I went and I did portraits of all these people, and at first I was kind of scared, intimidated, but then I make a picture, and then I'd go print it, bring them back, and give them prints, and they loved it. And before I knew it, I became part of the scene. So I went from being an outsider to being part of it. In the book you're talking about, actually, there's Rosie shooting up. I didn't publish that work, but they were shooting up heroin and stuff like that, and they let me in to photograph and do whatever I wanted to. Became part of the scene. So sorry, what was your question again? I was just kind of leading up to that.
Well, can photography play a role in change?
So what happened there is I really wanted to show the world what was really going on in this culture, because I had been so intimidated and scared by it. And then once I got to know them, I went, oh my God, these are actually wonderful people, but drugs had taken over their lives, et cetera. And I wanted to kind of show that. And I thought, people, once they see this, they'll do something about it. And instead, my career took off, and it didn't help them at all. And I got shows, I got NEA grants, I got things like that. But it was awakening for me at ripe old age of 24 that even though that work, my intentions were good, I was inadvertently exploiting them. I was benefiting a lot and not really helping them. And so it was and then at that point, I turned away from photographing people altogether. I went into the desert, and that was it for years and years and years. And basically, I rarely photograph people. And if I do, they're usually really far away. They're almost not identifiable. that said, I kind of was embarrassed and felt badly about it when I kind of had that insight. But now, 50 years later, and I look at that work and I go, oh my God, I'm so glad I did that work, because it records a historical moment like no other medium. Words, painting, interviews, nothing, photographs capture something you just can't do any other way. And I think that record, you know, it didn't help those people individually at the time, but I think as a society that there's a value. So I've come back around to seeing that maybe my own self-critique at the point was maybe a little unwarranted.
And photographs can have unexpected roles. I mean, they can do unexpected things. I mean, one of the things that Ansel says, I think I have to believe him, is that he never took a photograph with an environmentalist purpose in mind. He took photographs because he wanted to make something beautiful. But then they're used by the Sierra Club, which he promoted, that helped pave the way for eventually the Wilderness Act and other environmental causes. So they certainly can play a role, but it can be a little bit perhaps unusual or unexpected.
And I would just say, and this applies to Ansel as well as myself, that sometimes we think we're doing something, and you know, time and stuff can kind of show that to be really different. And I do, you know, I've made all this work over these years, and for me, it's been an ongoing diary of my life kind of thing. I can't, you know, 30 years from now, I don't know what people might look at it and go, ooh, you know, this guy was blah, blah, blah. I don't know, you know. The historical moment can change the way another historical moment looks, and we see that all the time.
We've got, I want to take, maybe just ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up for the audience. One of the things that Ansel talks about, and we put in the exhibition, is the importance of Yosemite as his place, and he develops this deep sense of place. And he said that he knew his destiny when he first visited Yosemite as a 16-year-old kid. I'm not sure if the desert had quite the same impact on you, but it's clearly very important. And I was just wondering if you could just talk a bit about the importance of the desert to you and your own development as a photographer and a person.
Yeah. So around 1979, I started wandering into the American Desert West. And what I discovered immediately is that, one, it had been virtually ignored by photographers. People had gone to the great national parks and photographed there, or New York City, the streets of New York City, you know, photographed. But American desert was not. And I'm not talking about Death Valley or a place like that. And so that was one thing. And then I loved the heat, and I loved the big open space. It was unlike any place I'd ever been. And I loved the way that the big open space, you would see human civilization's impact on it. It would be kind of very unusual but powerful, because it kind of, like if you're in a forest, you can't see all the stuff going on there. But in a big open landscape, if there's developments or pollution or garbage or whatever, it's really there. It's laid out. So I kind of both fell in love with the desert. I loved being there. I would go in my Volkswagen camper. And one of the things I mentioned, from Ansel, I got this idea of building a ramp on top of my Volkswagen bus so that I could both sleep on there but also photograph from there. And I would travel for 3 weeks into the desert and just explore and wander around. And I so loved being there. And starting in 1979, I began what's called the Desert Cantos. It's the fires, the floods, the dead animal pits, the nuclear test site. There's 40 cantos at this point. And it's still in theory ongoing. It basically won't stop until I stop working there. And yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. Well, Richard, thank you very much. And what I like to do is open it up to the audience. I would imagine that there might be some questions for our guest speaker tonight. Yes. Sir.
When you're shooting an 8x10 view camera, it's upside, you're looking at the ground with glass, and it's upside down detachments, right?
Yeah.
And so the image becomes very geometric and aestheticized. But when you're shooting, like I thought the floating saw at Gagosian, and gorgeous prints, just beautiful.
Thank you.
I thought they were shot with a digital bag.
So that's actually, so the question is that from 1979 to basically 2006, I used an 8x10 view camera, kind of what you saw me with. But once with digital came along and got to a certain level, around 2006, I switched to a Hasselblad with a digital back. The quality now is better than the 8x10. So going to the people floating in the ocean, the ones there actually were shot with an 8x10. So from right after 9/11, that was a long story and I couldn't get into it, but that work was actually inspired by the people falling from the buildings in 9/11. The way I saw them from above, it was kind of reversed. I shot them with 8x10. I did a book called On the Beach. From 2002 to 2006, I believe, were all those images. Then I shifted to a digital camera, and since then I've been photographing. And the show you saw in New York was actually, I think, probably all those were shot with a digital camera after that. So I'm still actually working at that same place. So I go back and forth between the desert and then Hawaii. I kind of cleanse the palette. I've found over the years that by going away from the desert and doing something that's so different, and then going back, I see it fresh again, and vice versa.
When you're shooting a view camera versus a digital back, you're seeing it with digital, you're seeing it as it is.
Yes.
Do you find it more difficult to sort of, well, to compose, to think about it? Does it trigger something different in your brain?
Yeah, so what's interesting about an 8x10 view camera, for any of you that use it, when you're framing, looking at the landscape through it, it's upside down. And the first 2 years that I used it, it made me nuts. I mean, it's not a casual adjustment. It's like, it's so weird. But you do it, and before you know it, your brain flips it. It's just crazy like that. But then going back to digital camera, that is actually corresponds to your normal vision. So that's easy. You just adjust right back to that. But I think the only thing I would say is that upside down is the whole way that Ansel worked and the way I started working, which has been transcended by digital, was so primal, so primitive. I mean, from the way I'd be photographing people in the ocean, doing handstands. All right, I see something amazing. I see a baptism going on in the ocean. I run to get my camera. I set it up. I focus. I'd reach down and get my thing, and it was done. I miss it over and over again. With the digital camera, boom, done, right? So it was so crude, but that's all we had to get that kind of quality. Once digital came along, it's enabled me. Now I go back and I photograph, and I can catch a woman doing a handstand on a surfboard, 15 different poses in 12 seconds, whereas with an 8x10, I would have gotten one shot off. And so it's just a different way of working.
Yes. I know you kind of take photos of kind of the existence of humans, but it kind of really shows if humans were extinct, at least what I see. And do you see that kind of your photos more telling a future more than the past? Or do you see, is that you coming out of the photo, or is that your subconscious kind of bringing stuff together?
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So, do you?
I guess like your political side of your photography, are you personally putting that into your photos, or are you subconsciously putting that in your photos?
I think it's probably both. I mean, I think often what I'll do is and this may work. I'll go on a shooting trip, and you work really quick, and you see something like I go, oh, that audience is all configured away, do it, and then you do hundreds of pictures like that when you're traveling and looking for pictures or wherever you're working. Then you come back, and I've learned over the years to put them away for 6 months, and then look at them fresh, because often, if you're like excited at the moment of taking the picture, you always love that picture when you get home, and inevitably later on, it's maybe not. It doesn't hold up. So I think that distance often allows you to come back and look and see what's there. And I don't know how much. Some of it's intentional, but then there's always stuff that just gets in there, because it's like with a frame. It's not like a painting where you control every single dot of what you put in that frame. the thing about a photograph, you've got this delimiting thing, and how well you use it is the art. But you're always going to have tons of information in there that you can't control, so it's how you receive it. I don't know if that answered.
Post-Katrina and the Berkeley fires. So here you are with an 8x10 on a tripod. People are coming up to you. Do they criticize you? They're like, what are you doing, man? But what is that experience? Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is first I photographed Katrina, but it was a couple months after the event happened. And in fact, when I went there, and I asked the New York Times to give me a press pass so I could get in there, because it was, the National Guard was there. They laughed at me because said, the event's over. I mean, there's nothing, you know, it's old news, it's already been shown and da-da-da-da. And so when I went there, I was by myself. It was just me and the National Guard. So I don't know if you're talking about when I was actually there on the spot, but nobody was there, so that was basically an abandoned, decimated universe. So I photographed, and I put most of that work away for the 20 years. I did that with the Oakland fire you're talking about. Same thing, I didn't photograph right after. In fact, again, I wasn't inclined to do that. I didn't want to be part of the spectacle, I guess is what I'd say, of the news spectacle. But a friend came to California and said, I want to go see it. And we drove up there. Nobody was there, because I guess it had burned down. So basically it was abandoned. So it was just what it was. And so I was kind of wandering around, not seeing anybody, just all by myself. It's very surreal.
Yes.
Can you think of a photographic technology that doesn't currently exist that you wish existed or you predict will exist in the future?
Say again, a photograph of what?
A photographic technology that does not currently exist that you wish existed.
Well, that's interesting, because I'm not sure what's coming with AI, but I think it's coming, and but I don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, so far I've loved the technology, both the film that I was able to use and then the digital stuff. For me, it's been so fulfilling and rich. But I also know that people are so like, oh my God, AI is coming and it's going to destroy things. They said that about 35mm camera, that it was going to destroy photography, right? Well, that didn't happen. They said that about color, you know. They said that about digital. Each one of these new technological developments actually has allowed photography to kind of expand and grow its language. And photography, and even social media. I mean, I thought, oh my God, everybody's taking pictures. Who's going to be interested in photography anymore? No, it doesn't work that way. It's like, it's such a powerful language that all these different versions are kind of new tools for us. So I'm actually, I wish I was just younger so that I could see where AI is going to go, because I think it's probably 3 years out. But I have a feeling it could be really interesting. Digitization not only allowed me to capture things really fast, it allowed me to scan my old 8x10s and print them at 8x10 feet. You'd be amazed if you put an 8x10 shot negative like that and then blow it up. There's so much information that's just buried in there that's so interesting. So,
Well, since this is apparently the year of AI on our campus, I
is
guess, so.
well,
it's
whoever
right-
you
yes,
doing that, let me
yes.
know. I want to play. Okay.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, you broke all the rules with your develop process, and now that you've gone, we've gone digital, how has that affected your process there?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know if you saw the new work where I just kind of started putting negatives and positives together, and I tend to still experiment. So I tend to still, like the cargo ships is pretty straight, pretty Ansel Adams, if you will. And then there's this other side where I'm always experimenting and playing with new ideas. And I was commissioned to do all the art for a new psychiatry building in San Francisco during COVID, and I was stuck at home. And so I took all these images. I didn't show any tonight. I took all these images that I'd never printed, that I'd shot but I'd not used, and I experimented in Photoshop. And I just did, again, if I had AI, But with digital technology, Photoshop, I was able to make images from these raw materials that worked in a psychiatry building that, you know, not dead animals, not things that could upset people that are having challenges, but make really beautiful things by experimental, strange things. The photographic medium is so rich and with potential. It's infinite.
That seems like a perfect way to end our evening.
Thank you all.
Richard. Thank you.